All right, welcome everybody to Power and Empowerment, brought to you by the Baltimore County Bar Association. My name is Jason Garber, and with me...
Hey guys, I'm Robbie Leonard. I am an attorney at the firm Leonard and McCliggott. I am one of the partners with Mary McCliggott. We practice all kinds of areas of law. And Jason, what kind of law do you do?
I do mostly civil litigation, meaning that non-criminal, not family, those kind of things. Helping businesses or individuals that have court problems. I also do some land use stuff, that is how land gets developed or other such things. But it's been a long career. I have done criminal defense as well. Other areas of law. It's been a very diverse career for me in that regard.
So we're doing a program today on voting, right? It's called Power and Empowerment. Who has the power in our society? Who gets to vote and why? And how can we, the people, be engaged and empowered? Why does this have relevance with lawyers? Why are we lawyers talking about voting?
Well, it's been over the course of American history, and certainly as recently as this past election, that obviously the laws that you use to regulate and govern elections, sometimes disputes arise, and you need lawyers and judges to sort through the problems, and also you need, oftentimes, some lawyers to help write the laws and regulations that govern elections.
So I don't know if he was a lawyer, but he was the first president of the United States, and he had a pretty sweet wig. George Washington, he was unanimously elected the first president of the United States of America by electors on April 30th, 1789, and again in 1792 until March 4th, 1797. He served 2 terms. And both votes of the electors were unanimous. His vice president was John Adams, who was later voted the second president of the United States of America.
And John Adams was a lawyer.
He was.
He actually is infamous for defending British soldiers at a time where there was obviously a lot of hostility towards the British.
I think it was interesting on that slide that I'm talking about electors, because I feel like when we watch election results, we see about the Electoral College, and every 4 years it seems like it's something completely brand new. And it's just funny seeing how that's how it worked when George Washington, the first president, was voted in, but we still we don't know how it works.
Right.
We don't understand how it works.
It needs a remedial explanation every 4 years for people.
So I don't know if you guys know this, but when you vote, you're really voting for an elector. You're not even voting for president, really. You're voting for an elector who's assigned to voting for president. It's a really complicated system, but it's what we got, and it's been working since, 1776 or whenever George Washington...
1789.
1789?
Yes.
I don't even know this stuff. Well, I guess that's what the next slide says. So,
well, do you know anybody that's been an elector, Robbie?
I served in the Electoral College in 2016, so I have that experience.
So you actually voted for the president?
I did. I was one of 10 electors in the state of Maryland who voted in the 2016 election. It was pretty cool. I still have the pen that I used where I signed all the certificates. I have framed certificates. That would have been a much cooler background than a ladder and a space heater in my garage.
But this is closer to what the framers of the Constitution of our country had.
Yes.
So
they probably would have had a log cabin. I don't
right.
know. So the next slide, George Washington in 1787, he presided over the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, during which the U.S. Constitution was written. The U.S. Constitution outlined a representative government with checks and balances among 3 branches of government: the executive, the legislative branch, and judicial branch. Finally, on the next slide, during Washington's presidency, the Bill of Rights, which were the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution, was adopted in 1791. And those Bill of Rights guarantees the rights of the American people. Okay, Jason, pop quiz. What are the first 10 amendments?
All right, you have First Amendment.
Oh, what do you say? The First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Third Amendment?
Yes. Well, First Amendment, everyone knows freedom of speech, freedom of exercise of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. So that's First Amendment. Second Amendment, everyone knows, concerns the right to bear arms from a well-regulated militia, be necessary to the defense. The rights to bear arms shall not be infringed upon. Right. The third.
Here's a fun fact for you. Jason thought the right to bear arms meant sleeveless shirts, but it's guns.
Yes. and for my case, it's also guns as well.
Yeah. Third Amendment. You don't know the Third Amendment.
Sure. No quartering troops. That is, you can't have people command people to stay at your house. So that is the Third Amendment. It is not one regularly used.
No.
To put it mildly.
All right. 4.
Search and seizure.
5.
Due process.
6.
And also right to not incriminate yourself. 6. Right to counsel.
7. No one knows the Seventh Amendment.
Right to jury.
8.
That's after 7.
8 is. I think 8 is no cruel and unusual punishment. Is that right? Is that part of that?
I think that was 6 or 7.
Okay.
7 maybe.
Do you know 9?
Maybe it's 8.
We don't know 9 or 10. Look.
No, 10 is the powers reserved to the states.
That is true. That is true.
Well, what is 9? I know there are no quartering troops, but I don't know.
The Ninth Amendment.
Right.
The Ninth Amendment is probably a really important one. We'll edit this later.
Yeah.
Get that one.
Right. In fact, why don't you? That's what we should have done. Is we should have said, why don't you guys tell us what the 8th and 9th Amendments are?
Yes. You in the red shirt.
Good job.
Correct.
That's it.
And then George Washington, our first president, he died on December 14th, 1799.
Trivia for you.
What's that?
John Adams, our second president. Thomas Jefferson, our third president. And John Marshall, the first Supreme Court Chief Justice. All died July 4th in the same year. It was 1826, I think, or 27.
Really?
I think that's, yeah.
Wow.
All 3.
Crazy.
Right?
Wow.
So, let me ask you this. How many of you would have voted for George Washington in 1789?
Well, I think, how many of you could have voted for George Washington in 1789?
That's a better question, because this is not as interactive as this presentation has been designed.
Yes. So, how are we going to find out if someone was eligible to vote back then?
Well, don't you first need to know the denominator, that is, how many people we're talking about who could
How many
in
people,
the universe of potential voters?
then how many people were around in 1790?
And remember, they're counting citizens by this point.
Okay.
Because the U.S. Census from 1790, the total population was 3,893,874.
And of those 3,893,874, how many of those could vote, Jason?
I don't know. Maybe we could figure this out through some math and slides.
Next slide. So 694,207 of that total were slaves and could not vote.
Right.
So
But remember, the Constitution did not count black people as full citizens, and if you were a slave in particular, you didn't have the rights even as much as someone who was not a slave.
What about Native Americans? Could they vote?
Well, Native Americans, I mean, I have to think because they're Native. Should they be able to vote?
They're in the name Americans, Native Americans.
They were here. They were born here.
It says they were not counted in the census and were not considered citizens at the time. So in 1790, 0 Native Americans were eligible to vote.
So out of that 3.8 million that we discussed, 0 of them were Native Americans.
Okay, how about women? They surely could have voted.
Half the country had to be women, right?
At least.
So I would say, yeah, women have to be able to vote.
Well, I don't know about that. The next slide says, I don't think they could yet, because what was it? I think it was in 1920.
Well, right. It is in fact 1920 with the, I want to say 19th Amendment?
That's right.
Is when women actually obtained the right to vote. Now, there's a long progression of the history of women being able or being permitted to vote in states and whatnot. Ironically enough, Wyoming was the most progressive state on women holding elected office and voting. They were the first. But it didn't become a federal right for women to be able to vote until 1920.
Yes. And if you were under 21 years of age, you too were not able to vote. So right now you can vote when you're 18 years old or older. But here's something you guys should know. Definitely for high school students too. You can vote if you're under 18, Jason. Do you know how?
Yes.
How?
You can register to vote if you're going to turn 18 by the time of the next election, within the registration period, that is.
The next general election.
General election.
So if you are 17 years old in a primary election, you can vote as long as you turn 18 by the election day in November. So make sure, I think in Maryland, you can register to vote when you're 16 years old. So when you go get your driver's license or if you get an ID, you can register to vote then to make sure that you can vote when you're 18. But back when George Washington days, couldn't vote when you were 18.
Couldn't drive, couldn't vote.
Nope. But you know what? The lifespan back then was probably like 30 years old, so they didn't have a lot of opportunity to vote.
Right.
Okay, so what do we have left? We've got white males, age 21 and over, but there's one more issue. Do you own property to vote?
That's right. You have to be a landowner in order to vote. That leaves you with 6% of the total population out of that 3.8 million that's eligible to vote.
Well, congratulations to you, 6%. You elected the first president of our country. You did a great job. He ended up on the quarter, the $1 bill.
He has a whole monument named after him.
We're lucky you had such great judgment. We thank you.
Now, the preamble to the Constitution states that it was created to form a more perfect union. That whole concept of what a more perfect union is has evolved over the years to address some of the issues we have raised before about who can vote.
Right. It's my philosophy that the more people who vote, the better. Right. We have a more representative society. When women vote, African Americans vote, Asian Americans vote, teenagers vote. We need everyone's voice to be heard so that our laws can reflect the will of the citizens. If it's just rich old white men, then that's who our representatives are going to be making laws for. Right?
Not to mention, you want people who live in the country to be invested in that country, to have their ideas and have their contribution mean something, and so to get legislation that could help benefit others, and protect the environment or protect businesses and whatever else. The only way that happens is if more people participate, and that's what this country did over the course of the next 200 plus years, is start figuring out a way to get more people involved.
So the next slide talks about how that started. So some states started to loosen up. There was no requirement to own land. That was the first rule to go. So they got rid of the property owning right.
But they weren't so ready to definitely get rid of as much of that, how should we say, wealth-oriented background, because you had to be a taxpayer then in order to vote. And that is, that you're a taxpayer, lasted even into the 20th century. Several states still had that on the books, that you had to pay taxes. Now, I know that may sound weird, but you'll hear why that's an important distinction down the road.
And then in the 1860s, big things started to happen. First, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and then the 14th Amendment established U.S. citizenship to former slaves, extended federal rights to the states, due process and equal protection, among other things. So what happened after the ratification of the 13th and 14th Amendments?
We get the 15th Amendment.
Yes, and so that was ratified in 1870, and Section 1 of the 15th Amendment states that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Section 2, the Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation.
So after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, we're good, right? We have a more perfect union now because we see in the Constitution now that there's a right to vote. That is, you cannot be discriminated against for any reason to allow you to vote. So we're good. And obviously, that means that in the 1872 election between Ulysses S. Grant and Horace Greeley, everyone could vote, right?
No.
No?
No.
What do you mean no?
Well,
fun fact, by the way, who would you have voted for between Ulysses S. Grant and Horace Greeley?
well, considering I've never heard of Horace Greeley, and I know Ulysses S. Grant is on the $50 bill,
Yes.
I think I'm going to go with that guy.
Yes, Ulysses S. Grant won. To no small part, the fact that Horace Greeley died before the election.
He did.
He did. He's the only presidential candidate to die before the election.
Oh, Horace.
Yes.
The whole future could have been different.
Very different.
Oh,
Was
well.
Horace Greeley the one to say go west?
What?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. So, which group had the opportunity to vote first? Was it women, African Americans, or Native Americans?
This is the part where you talk amongst yourselves for a little bit. So you guys can figure out, hey, who do you think obtained this right first?
What does the survey say?
Since we don't have access to any equipment that would tell us what you're saying, we'll just assume that you got it right. So, next slide where it says more perfect union of the right to vote. Let's take a look at what happened to all these groups from 1790 forward. African Americans had the technical right to vote after the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments were enacted and ratified. But obviously, for the remainder of the 1800s and throughout the 1900s, and even still today, states have created obstacles that prevented African Americans from voting or otherwise suppressed the votes in precincts with high concentration of minority voters. There is a lot of litigation that goes on with these kind of tactics that's still in effect as recently as this past election, and there are more lawsuits that are being geared up now for anticipated legislation in state legislatures today for the next election.
Yeah. And Jason, you're smart because you earlier said that Wyoming was the first state to allow women to vote in 1869. But women did not have the right to vote until the 19th Amendment was enacted in 1920.
That's right.
So African Americans could technically have the right to vote first, even though in practice it didn't always work out that way. And then women had the right to vote in 1920. And then finally, Native Americans were not considered full citizens until 1927, and even still could not vote in some states on the basis they were not taxpayers or there were language requirements. For example, in 1948, New Mexico and Arizona courts struck down provisions regarding the taxpayer requirement and literacy and language requirements. So Native Americans didn't start having the full right to vote until Voting Rights Act of 1965 and subsequent legislation in 1970. And that's just crazy to me, considering George Washington was our first president in the 1700s. We have a class of people called Native Americans who were here first, but yet we didn't let them vote until, the 1960s. When my parents, were alive.
And that's it. That's just right. Because they were not considered citizens. They were not taxpayers because they were exempt from taxation. So we go back to the taxpayer requirement. That was a way to make sure that Native Americans could not vote.
So and then, for those between 18 and 21 years of age, you didn't get the right to vote until the 26th Amendment in 1971. And, just seeing how recent some of these laws were, it just shows you that we're still constantly evolving, right? Like, we're trying to make progress. Sometimes it feels like it takes forever, but you never know what's going to happen next. Like if sometimes we feel like something's never going to happen, we might make progress.
Well, the concept of a more perfect union gives us, I guess, the inspiration or the push to keep trying to live up to the ideal of why this country was founded, and on the basis of that we should be better than other systems and other places that would not allow most people to vote. And this is something that, as we see, it's a never-ending battle and a never-ending fight to try to make sure that everybody has the same right.
So let's talk about some of the issues that were around in the 1960s, and talk about how some of those same issues could be cropping back up, like right now after the 2020 election. So our next slide about the 1960s. Back in 1964, the 24th Amendment prohibits poll taxes in federal elections.
What a poll tax did was basically, as it sounds, it charged people to be able to have the right to vote. And so if you didn't come up with the money to pay for the poll tax, you couldn't vote. It was a way to make sure, it was a way to specifically exclude people at the time of the election.
And then in 1965, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibited racial discrimination in voting, also helps regulate elections. States were barred from enacting laws that had the effect of discrimination on the basis of race or language. Example, literacy tests. So what's important there is when you hear the effect of discriminating. So, some states, they weren't going to say black people can't vote, right? They knew they couldn't do that. So they tried to circumvent that and make other ways to exclude black Americans without saying that specifically.
And Hispanic, and again, Native American, and others. So as long as you were not speaking English or in some other favored class, they would find some way to figure out how to minimize the vote from black Americans, from Hispanic Americans, or whomever. So that is as recent as 1965, where we had the legislation to actually, again, ban discrimination in voting.
I mean, just think about it. We, at this point, our schools weren't even integrated. We weren't, the United States wasn't allowing, black children and white children to go to schools together. So, when they're making laws knowing that black children aren't able to get the public education, they know that they're not going to have as high literacy rates back then, and so they create these laws that way to specifically exclude minority groups.
And some of the tests that they used to give to some people were designed for them to fail, such as how many marbles are in this jar, things along those lines, to make sure that they cannot answer the question. So they didn't even get to a fundamental issue as to their formal education. Sometimes it was designed questions that nobody would be able to get the answer to, but they were only asked to certain people.
So we talked about the 24th Amendment prohibiting poll taxes in federal elections, but in 1966, the Supreme Court extended the prohibitions from the 24th Amendment to all elections, pursuant to the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So that was the 60s. Voting issues today. So voting access and voting rights remains active issues today. What are some issues we're dealing with now?
So we see that there's been, across the United States, because of the pandemic, a push for vote by mail. Now, many states already had vote by mail for many years. That by itself is not the problem. Some states, it's exclusively voting is done by mail. Other states started trying to increase their voting by mail in this past election, and that was a cause of some controversy for some people.
If they use this video of Jason and I talking about this in 10 years, and the kids are going to be watching this, like, why are these two guys wearing these masks?
Right.
They're a bunch of weirdos.
Right. First of all, look at the garage that they're in.
Yeah.
Second of all, they're wearing masks.
Why are they sitting so far apart wearing masks? Well, we're in a pandemic, people. This is the year 2021, coming out of 2020. And in Maryland, a state of emergency by our governor allowed him to order vote by mail. Okay, so in our primary election and general election, we really ramped up voting by mail. And so in the first round, in the primary in Maryland, every single registered voter was mailed a ballot. Okay? And in the general election, it was almost like that, but every voter was mailed an application for a ballot. So if you wanted to vote by mail, you would have to complete it, and you could do it online, or you could mail it back in. And if you completed it, then they would mail you a ballot. And we had like extremely high voter turnout because you didn't have to leave your house.
Right. And in fact, this is the highest turnout presidential election in I don't know about ever, but in ages, in decades or even centuries, because of the vote by mail.
But, you know, there are some states, whether they were governors or courts or legislatures, who don't always, you know, agree with expanding voting rights and the ease and access of voting. So even currently today, you know, there were some limits placed on how people could vote. In Texas was a big example where the governor limited. We have drop boxes too, where you could, you know, if you wanted to vote but you didn't want to send it by mail, you just fill out your ballot and drop it off with the Board of Elections drop box, where one of the Board of Elections workers would go pick up the ballots at the end of the day. And in Texas, the governor restricted it to one drop box location per county. And the crazy thing about that, at least in my opinion, it was a crazy thing about that, is you might have one extremely rural county in Texas, or like in the desert, where there's not many people living, and they get one drop box. And then in the county where Houston is, which is the third largest city in the United States of America, they also had one drop box location.
Harris County, Texas, has 4.2 million people. And then, from what I recall, there's a county called Loving, Texas, Loving County, and that has 156 people. So to give you the disparity, you have one for 156 and one for 4.2 million.
Yeah.
And when the election started, there were multiple drop boxes. It was in the middle where they decided to change it to one.
And so we, you know, they're still, you know, trying to change laws. Voter identification is always a big, a hot button issue about whether someone should have a photo ID with them when they go show up to vote, or if, you know, their signature is good enough. The right to vote if somebody has criminal convictions. Maryland recently, within the past few years, passed a law to allow felons, people with felony convictions on their record, the right to vote. Previously, they couldn't vote. You lost your right to vote if you had a felony conviction. But they changed that, and to even further expand the right to vote for people who commit crimes, a lot of people are talking about trying to allow people who are currently in jail the right to vote.
And that's a good thing because, again, you get more people to be invested in society. It never, frankly, rang true to me that why you would take away someone's right to vote, because if anything, you want people who are inclined to commit crimes to buy into society, that is, not give them things that make them participate and want to join everybody else instead of taking from everybody else.
All right, we're going to make this interactive. You ready? Okay. Raise your hand in class if you think people in jail right now on election day should be allowed to vote. Like if they should have a polling place in there. And
vote by mail?
Sure, vote by mail, or even if they were just going to vote, you know, bring in some voting booths in a jail and have them walk over and fill it out. Who thinks they should do that? All right, who doesn't think they should do that? They say, no, if you committed the crime, you got to do the time. You've lost your right to vote. Okay, well,
now we know.
Now we know how you guys feel. Okay.
So, when it comes down to it, one of the things that I like talking to younger voters about is the power of their vote. So, number one, I hear from others that from time to time, I talk to them, they say, well, this person's not doing what I want them to do, I'm not going to vote for anybody at all in this election because nobody's doing what I want. And that's the worst thing you could do, because no one is going to pay attention to you unless you're a voter. Because remember, these people are elected representatives. They become elected representatives because they get the most votes. If you remove yourself from that process, you are removing your voice from that process. So please vote. And to give you an idea as to how sensitive that can be, there are some recent elections that I've pointed out here that show how narrow some of the margins for the victory of these people were. For example, in 2017, you had a state house district race that ended in a tie and had to be decided by a coin flip. In 2018, Baltimore County Executive John L. Chesky Jr. won the primary by only 17 votes. There was another state race in Kentucky and in Alaska. Both were decided by 1 vote. Even today, after the November 2020 elections, there's still 2 House of Representatives seats that are up in the air because the margins of victory are so close. They have to be settled by either the courts or they're still doing a recount. So all of this shows every individual vote does matter and has an impact. So your vote will matter and it has an impact.
Well, guys, we really appreciate you joining this class, and your voice and participation are important. So I'm encouraging you guys to vote. We appreciate you listening to us and voting along with us in today's session. Thanks, you guys, and make sure you get out there and register to vote. Don't forget.
So that was 30 minutes.